ינום, לא ינום ולא יישן, לא ינום ולא יישן, שומעי ישראל.
Ho, ho, ho! Are those guys amazing? If Hashem lo yivnei bayis, if Hashem does not build the house, it will not last. That is the Shira choir singing. And what a great lesson. If we don't build something that is consistent with the eternal values of God and God's Torah, it will not last. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's great to be learning with you on a Sunday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us as we get it going on a Sunday night in December, the last one of 2020? Won't be bad to get 2020 in our rear view mirror. Yehudit Sobel in Florence, South Carolina. Renee Fought in Indy. Melissa in Great Neck. John is in Sedona. Randy in Florida. Fred says shalom. Isabel says shalom again. James, shalom from Indianapolis. Marion from Medford in Long Island, New York. Hannah in Mississippi. Stephen in New Hampshire. Bill in Arkansas. Lucy in Minnesota. Fred in Miami Beach. Ari in Atlanta. Teddy in Kansas City. Julie Christensen says blessings to all, shalom from Texas. Shoshana from North Miami Beach. Hyamberg says good evening. Adriana says shalom. Jumbe Brown from Tanzania. Welcome, Jumbe. It's so great to have you learning with us. Charles from San Antonio, Texas. Jill from Illinois. Thea from Fresno. Thevi from Orlando, Mary from Boston, Renee says amen, Joyce says shalom, Michael from Duluth, Minnesota, Hilly says hello from Philly, and Michelle says shalom. Welcome everybody, great to have you with us. Over on the YouTube side, Neil from Virginia, Lynn from North Texas, Sheila from Montana. Welcome everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is dedicated by Sue Strauss in the house. Sue is dedicating tonight's class to members of her family who have passed on. Her parents, Herman Strauss and Ruth Krisky Strauss, and her brother, Arthur Terry Strauss. May their memories be for a blessing. May their souls be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. And may the merit of our learning today bring their neshamas ever higher into the celestial realms of the world of souls. And we say amen. The class is also dedicated by Roy Niederhofer, who is dedicating the class in honor of Sal and Nina. Thank you so much, Roy. May you and Sue have blessings shower down upon you and all your loved ones. And we say amen. We are holding, this is Lamed Vav, page Lamed Vav, that's page 36 of Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud. We're studying the laws of Passover. We're in chapter 2, continuing our discussion of the sixth Mishnah. We have been talking, for so long, we were talking about what's prohibited on Passover, namely chametz, leavened bread, leavened products. We have to get them out of our possession, out of our homes. We talked about the time that it has to be done by, the manner that we have to get rid of, etc., etc. Yesterday, we started talking about what we are obligated to do during the festival of Matzahs, Passover. Namely, we have to eat matzah. It is an obligation to eat matzah on the first night of the week-long holiday. That's in Israel. outside of Israel because the first 2 days we celebrate the first day, which is its own festival, as a 2-day holiday outside of Israel, because back in the day, when the calendar was set by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem and the word had to get out into the provinces and it couldn't travel that quickly in a time before telegraphs, telephones, internet, etc. It was more like the Pony Express, and it took time to get the word out that the new month had started. And so holidays came to be celebrated as 2-day holidays outside the land of Israel. So we have an obligation when we live outside of Israel to eat matzah on the first 2 nights, right? At the first 2 seders, the seder, which we celebrate on both nights, the first 2 nights of Passover outside of Israel. In Israel, they just have 1 seder on the first night, and that's when they're obligated to eat matzah. So now we're talking about, okay, we're obligated to eat matzah. What kind of matzah counts so that we can fulfill our obligation? As we saw yesterday, the matzah has to be made out of one of the 5 grains, wheat, barley, rye, spelt, or oats, and it cannot be made out of rice or millet. And we went on and talked about how rice and millet and corn and legumes and other, grain-like substances came to be prohibited in the northern European Jewish communities, even though it's permitted to eat those foods during Passover, prohibited to make matzah out of them, permitted to eat them according to halacha, but later rabbis, and by later I mean 1,000 years ago, came to prohibit those grains because they would get mixed in transportation with the sacks that carried the kinds of grain that are permitted on Passover. And so those other kinds came to be prohibited. If you're curious about that, that's called Knead. If you want to learn more about that and you missed yesterday's class, you want to listen to yesterday's class. Okay, today we're talking about some other nuances of what kind of matzah, what dough, what grain is permitted to be used to make our matzah so that we fulfill our obligation on the first night or the second night as well outside of Israel of Passover. One might have thought, says the Gemara, that we can fulfill our obligation to eat matzah with dough taken from the second tithe. What is the second tithe? Right, so tithing, very important. By the way, the people who dedicated tonight's class, thank you so much. If you're interested in dedicating a class, you can do that, right, with your Meiser money, with the money you set aside as a tithe to give to good causes. You should be setting aside 10% of your net income to support charities that alleviate hunger, shelter, clothing, education, right? Like that they really provide for people's basic needs, that help them get employment as well, so that people are taken care of so they're not suffering, right? And education, Torah education, counts as one of those causes. So we are obviously a good cause to give to. I'm actually going to share a link later. I don't know if Nina has it available there. I think she does not have it available. So I'll put it in the comments later, and I'll share a post about Magen Am. So that's an organization that trains Jews to be armed and licensed to carry firearms in synagogue. Tragically, we live in a time, once again, where we are afraid in our houses of worship, and crazy people might come in and try to kill people. And so training people to save lives. Hatzolah is another wonderful organization. It's a paramedic Jewish organization. All these kinds of organizations is where your tithe should go. What is a tithe? So a tithe, by definition, is the 10th. As we've talked about a bunch of times, the standard tithing process in ancient Israel, agricultural land, the first 2% would go to the priest, the next 10% would go to the Levium, who didn't get land in the inheritance, but their job was to assist the priests in running the temple, etc. And then would come the second tithe. And the second tithe was the next 10%, which in some years was the poor man's tithe, but in other years belonged to the person who set it aside, with the caveat, with the restriction that he has to use it in Jerusalem, right? So this is a way that God created a structure for people to save money during the year and have enough to go up on the pilgrimage festival to Jerusalem. Passover is the first one of the calendar year, the solar year, let's say. And then the next of the Jewish year as well, even counting from Rosh Hashanah. Passover is the first one, then Shavuos is the middle one, and then Sukkot is, well, that would be the next Jewish year. But at any rate, the spring holiday, the summer holiday, and the fall holiday, right? And during those pilgrimage festivals, you're supposed to go up to Jerusalem, and you shouldn't go up in a state of abject poverty. You should have this tithe that you set aside for yourself to take it up to Jerusalem. Now, if you're a wheat farmer, you're going to carry bags of wheat over your shoulder so that you can, use them to trade for other products that you need, like an inn and other food, once you're up in Jerusalem. No, the Torah also says that you can sell the produce of the second tithe, redeem it for money, but then that money, that second tithe, you would bind up in your hand and you would use it to get to cover your expenses when you went up to Jerusalem for one of these pilgrimage festivals, including Passover, right? So now the Gemara says, you might have thought that we can fulfill the obligation to eat matzah with matzah that's taken from grain of the second tithe that you brought up to Jerusalem with you. And then the Gemara says, you might have thought that, but then it gives a reason why you can't. And this is the reason of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili. And he says, no, you can't use matzah of the second tithe to fulfill your obligation to eat matzah. Why? Because at Deuteronomy 16:3, it says that you shall, go up to Jerusalem for to slaughter the festival offering, the Pesach, right, the lamb or the goat, and that you will eat it with matzah. And then it says, with matzah, lechem oni. With matzah, the bread of affliction. Specifically it says lechem oni, and that means the normal translation of that is the bread of the poor. Okay, the bread of the poor. We'll often say in English, the bread of affliction. But here, by affliction, we mean that somebody is impoverished, right? Just as we were impoverished when we were leaving Egypt, we actually were not impoverished at the very end because the Egyptians said, go, get out of here. And they even gave us silver and gold to take with us to sort of compensate us for all those years that we had been enslaved. But until those things were given to us, yeah, we were living as slaves. We were absolutely living in abject poverty in Egypt. We had lost everything. It had been taken from us when we were enslaved. And so that is lechem oni, the bread of affliction. Now, lechem oni, a poor person, so that's spelled, the word oni, with an ayin. Ayin is a silent letter, just like the first letter of the alphabet, aleph. And it's the vowel sound that gets attached to it, which makes it sound like oni. So you could spell it with an ayin or with an aleph. With an ayin, the word oni means a poor person. With an aleph, the word oni has a different meaning. Now you're talking about a mourner. It's a different kind of affliction, actually, but it is an acute mourner, meaning somebody who has lost a close relative and has to sit shiva for that person. Because the two words are so similar, differing only in the one silent letter, that the sound that we make with our mouth comes from the vowel that gets attached to it, oni, so bread of the poor, bread of the mourner, is like so similar to each other that Rabbi Yosef HaGalili says, okay, so this is bread that a mourner could eat, right? It has to be bread that a mourner could eat. The bread of the second tithe, the dough that's made of the second tithe, either from wheat of the second tithe or money that the wheat was redeemed and then the money was used to purchase, but the source of it was the second tithe. There's also a command in the Torah that the second tithe has to be consumed in joy, right? When you go up to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage festival, you actually have to manufacture joy in yourself. You must you must, if you want to fulfill your obligation to go up to Jerusalem, you must enjoy yourself, right? And that's another reason why you're given money, part of your own tithe, so that you can go up to Jerusalem in a state of joy. So, says Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, if bread of affliction is connected to the mourner, so then the second tithe, which must be consumed in joy, cannot be consumed by the mourner. This comes to teach that dough purchased with proceeds from the second tithe does not qualify to be used as matzah in order to fulfill our obligation on the first night of the holiday. However, Rabbi Akiva disagrees with Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, and he says the command to eat matzah is repeated in the Torah. The reason it's repeated is to amplify all the possible sources of where we get our dough and what kind of dough we use. So if at all possible, it's going to be included. And this, kind of attenuated teaching of the bread of the poor sounds similar to the bread of the mourner, and then that's going to preclude the second tithe. According to Rabbi Akiva, no, we don't buy it. What does lechem oni, the bread of the poor, come to exclude? According to Rabbi Akiva, as we mentioned yesterday, dough that's kneaded with wine or honey or milk, right? So if the dough is kneaded with wine, milk, or honey, as opposed to water, so then that would create a very rich bread, a rich type of matzah that would be made from it. And that is not allowed for the purpose of fulfilling our obligation of eating matzah on the first night of the holiday in Israel, or on the first 2 nights of the holiday outside of Israel. Then the Gemara says, well, wait a minute. Is it really so that Rabbi Akiva says that matzah, for the purpose of fulfilling our obligation of eating matzah, we're precluded from eating matzah where the dough is kneaded with wine, milk, or honey? Haven't we learned, not milk, wine, oil, or honey. I beg your pardon, wine, oil, or honey. Says the Gemara, haven't we learned that Rabbi Akiva says you cannot fulfill your obligation? And is it so that Rabbi Akiva said we cannot fulfill our obligation to eat matzah with dough that was kneaded with wine, oil, or honey? Well, we have a baraisa that seems to contradict that statement that Rabbi Akiva says we cannot fulfill our obligation with such matzah. In a baraisa, it says, if one made matzah out of dough that was kneaded with wine or oil or honey, Rabban Gamliel says that's prohibited and you need to burn it immediately. The sages, the rabbis say, if you knead it with wine, oil, or honey, it's actually going to leaven even more quickly than if you kneaded it with water. And so you have to be very careful to bake it quickly so that it doesn't have a chance to leaven. Right? What is leavened bread? We talked about this yesterday. Leavened bread doesn't only mean that yeast was added to it. These 5 basic grains, wheat, barley, rye, spelt, and oats, if you make dough out of them and mix it with water and you let it sit long enough, there's just an inherent fermentation that goes on in the combination of those grains with water, and it will rise by itself. So that's why you have to knead it and then and then bake it. Once it's baked, it's not going to rise anymore. So you have to get to the baking process quickly. And if you did it with wine, oil, or honey, according to the rabbis of this baraisa, you just have to be careful to get it baking quickly. And according to Rabbi Akiva, he tells a story that once it fell to him to feed the other sages during the Shabbos of Passover. Right? So Passover is a week-long holiday. It's always going to include at least 1 Shabbos, sometimes 2 if the first day falls on Shabbos. But the normal thing is that Shabbos falls out somewhere in the middle of Passover. And so you have a special Shabbos Pesach. And then they had a meal at Rabbi Akiva's house, right? So Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua came by Rabbi Akiva's house on the Shabbos of Pesach, and he made for them matzah out of dough kneaded with oil, right? Does he say oil or I think he says wine, oil, and honey. Yes. I kneaded for them dough with wine, oil, and honey. So I don't know if that means he had like some with wine, some with oil, or some with honey, or he had like some dough and he put wine, oil, and honey into it. One way or the other. It was made with wine, oil, and honey. And Rabbi Akiva reports that he made it this way for his fellow sages, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. And they said nothing to me, says Rabbi Akiva. They said nothing to me by way of objection. Therefore, so clearly we can make matzah during the festival of Passover with dough kneaded with wine, oil, and honey. So since Rabbi Akiva said you cannot fulfill your obligation with dough kneaded with matzah made from dough kneaded with wine, oil, and honey, we have a contradiction here. How do we resolve it? Says the Gemara, sure, for the intermediate days of Passover, it is permitted to eat unleavened bread, matzah, that was made from dough kneaded with wine, oil, and honey. That's rich matzah, rich man's matzah. But it is prohibited to use that kind of matzah on the first night at the Seder, or the first 2 nights outside of Israel for the Seders, when you are commanded to eat matzah and you are commanded to eat lechem oni, the bread of affliction, right? So here we see the difference between obligated and permitted. At the Seder, we're obligated to eat the bread of affliction. That can only be fulfilled with matzah made from dough kneaded with water. During the rest of the holiday, it is permitted to eat this rich matzah. It is matzah, it is unleavened bread, but it may not be used for that obligation to eat matzah, the poor man's bread, at the Seder. So that's the important distinction there. Okay. So then we have another teaching that Rabbi Yehoshua said, I think to his children, right? Yeah, Rabbi Yehoshua said to his sons, on the first night, do not make my matzah from dough kneaded with milk. But thereafter, for the other days of the festival, make my matzah from dough kneaded with milk. Gemara objects right away, and I know you're objecting right away. You're like, whoa. Not possible. We have already encountered this commandment from the sages. You do not ever mix milk into bread dough. Why? Because it's so common to eat our bread with meat, right? We make sandwiches with meat. We use the bread to kind of scoop meat. If you've ever eaten, in a kosher Ethiopian restaurant where, right, like there's like kind of meat on the plate and you use like the bread to kind of grab the meat or the vegetables out of it. In ancient times, bread and meat were going together all the time. So the sages decreed firmly that you never mix milk into your bread because it's so likely that your bread will end up coming into contact with meat, and then you would have violated the prohibition to eat milk and meat together. So how could Rabbi Yehoshua be saying to his sons that after the first night, okay, you can't fulfill your obligation to eat the poor man's bread with dough mixed with milk, but how could you have dough mixed with milk at any time to make matzah out of this milky dough? And so the Gemara's first way to resolve this problem is to say, that statement must have been wrong. It must have been, what the teaching meant to say was that on the first night, Rabbi Yehoshua said, do not make my matzah with dough mixed with honey. But from the second day on, yes, you can make my matzah, from this finer dough kneaded with honey. But then the Gemara says, actually, no, that is not the explanation. We're not going to rewrite the teaching. The teaching was that Rabbi Yehoshua said no milk in the dough on the first night. Thereafter, put milk in the dough for the matzah that I'm going to eat. And how could this possibly be explained? It is taught by Ravina that in the home of Rabbi Yehoshua and some other people who would do this, when they mixed milk into the dough and made a kind of dairy bread, or a dairy pastry, as it were, they would shape it in an unusual way, unlike the rest of their bread. In this case, they would shape it in the shape of an ox's eye, right? So clearly delineating that there's bread, and then there's this stuff, which we're going to make matzah out of a dough kneaded with milk, but we're going to give it a strange shape, like an ox's eye, which I guess is probably sort of like a bagel, but a little bit pinched off on the side, so it's more like an eye, but clearly discernible immediately at a glance that is not bread like the rest of our bread. That has dairy in it, and we can only eat it at a dairy meal. So, for example, they could dip it into their kutach, right, which is that dairy dip that we've talked about before. They could have, they could have it with cream cheese and lox, but they can't have it with a hamburger. You got it? They clearly delineate that if milk gets mixed into the dough, that product needs to look different than the other bread visually. Okay. And all agree that one may not knead the dough with warm water. Why? Because if you knead it with warm water, it will rise much more quickly than if with cold water. And then you're in greater danger of the dough leavening before you bake it, right? You shorten you shrink your margin of error where it might have risen before you got it into the oven. So all agree that when it comes to making matzah during Passover, you don't do that with warm water. Then the Gemara objects, but the meal offerings that were brought in the temple were kneaded with warm water. We have a tradition, a teaching that they were kneaded with warm water. What are the meal offerings of the temple? So even for during the rest of the year, nothing to do with Passover, there were many offerings brought in the temple. Peace offerings, thanksgiving offerings, sin offerings, guilt offerings, offerings of uncertainty, etc. Many of them involved animals. Poor people who could afford less would bring a smaller animal, or bird offerings. Or for the people who were very poor, where a bird offering, even that was too expensive, they could bring a meal offering, meaning it's basically bread. And even when you're bringing animal offerings, very often they are accompanied with bread, right? With a kind of bread that's brought in the temple. And that is unleavened bread. It is only unleavened bread that is offered on the altar along with animal sacrifices. So if all year long, the bread offerings which accompany the sacrifices are made of unleavened bread, and it needs to be unleavened bread, then why is it that the priests serving in the temple, the Kohanim, would knead the dough for that unleavened bread that accompanies the sacrifices with warm water? When we just said, no, you can't, during Passover, you can't knead it with warm water because you shrink that margin of error, and it's very possible that the bread will rise before you get it into the oven to bake it. And the Gemara answers its own question. Sure, for the regular run-of-the-mill person, we want to prohibit that because the margin of error is too small. But for the Kohanim in the temple, for the priests in the temple who are so diligent in following the rules to make sure that the offerings are offered properly, them, we can trust it. We can leave it to them. We don't have to make decrees on the priests that they're not allowed to knead with warm water. Of course they can do it with warm water because it makes a better bread. Everything is fine for them. And they're so diligent that they're going to make sure that that dough doesn't have a chance to rise before it goes into the oven. They have the finest equipment, right? The best ovens, the best vessels, the best trained people doing it. They're not going to come to make a mistake. We can't say the same for the average Joe Schmo trying to bake his matzah during Passover, something he's not even accustomed to doing the rest of the year. He only does it at Passover, whereas the priests in the temple do it all year round. But then the Gemara asks, and now I'm almost done. So if you have questions, please put them in the comments, and I will get to them quite soon. So then the Gemara asks, but wait a minute. With respect to kneading the dough, which, okay, they're going to do with warm water in the temple because the priests are doing it, is it actually so that only the priests are the ones kneading the dough for the meal offerings during the rest of the year? Is that true? And let's see what the Gemara says about this. The Gemara says, and with regard to kneading, like with water, in this case, warm water, is it performed only by diligent priests? But isn't it written? And this is from Leviticus chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. But isn't it written, and when anyone brings a meal offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil upon it, and place frankincense upon it, and he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and he shall take it from his handful of its fine flour and of its oil, together with all its frankincense. These verses indicate that from the scooping of a handful and onward, the mitzvah must be performed by the members of the priesthood. But this teaches about the pouring of the oil and the stirring of the mixture, that they are valid even if they are performed by any person, including a non-priest. And the Gemara answers its own question. With regard to kneading, although it is not performed necessarily by a diligent priest, it is nevertheless performed in the place of the diligent, right? So the people who are bringing these bread offerings to the temple during the rest of the year, they are allowed to do the kneading themselves. But they don't do it outside the temple on their own. They don't even do it inside the temple on their own. They do it under the supervision of the priests, right? So there is a check and balance on this process, that it's the priests are supervising. Kneading may be carried out by a non-priest, but it must still be performed in the temple courtyard. As the master said, mixing is valid if performed by a non-priest. However, if it is conducted outside the walls of the courtyard of the holy temple, the meal offering, is disqualified. And this serves to exclude other parts of the process. So we see that kneading with warm water, which is definitely prohibited when you're making matzah for Passover, okay, it's permitted in the precincts of the temple, when the priests do it, or even when somebody brings a meal offering and does it themselves, but under the supervision of the priests. For the regular Joe Schmo, not permitted. The final question that's addressed here in our daf is, so we know that it is the poor man's bread. Does that preclude one from using fine flour? Like we just mentioned, fine flour is what's used to bring bread offerings. So if a person wanted to use very fine flour to make his matzah, sort of like to beautify the mitzvah a little bit, is that permitted? Or since it's the bread of affliction, lechem oni, should it only be made with coarse flour, so it's a poorer bread, as it were? And there the sages say, no, we don't go that far. Even if one makes his matzah with flour sifted as fine as the flour of King Solomon, that is permissible not only for matzah of the whole week, but even to fulfill our obligation of eating matzah at the Seder, which must be the lechem oni. It doesn't get disqualified as lechem oni, poor man's bread, bread of affliction, because we used fine flour. It only would be disqualified if we used rich matzah, right? That was kneaded with honey or oil or wine. Okay. Let's check your comments and questions. David, just wanted to tell you, bless you, friend. You are so kind. That's so sweet, David Hampton Sawyer. And may you and all your loved ones be blessed with abundant blessings and an abundance in the new year. All the best to you. Renee Fought says, and I like the way you put this, tragically, I obtained a lifetime concealed carry permit and am now always armed, praying with a gun. It's a sadness. Exactly. I mentioned earlier that Maganam is an organization which trains Jews so that we can carry firearms in shul. What a shame, right? What a shame that we should need, it's a wonderful organization, but what a shame that it should be necessary in the world. When the Mashiach comes, when Messiah comes, okay, these kinds of problems will go away. We won't need weapons anymore, right? We'll beat our swords into plowshares, etc. Sadly, we don't live in that world yet. There are, psychos in this world, and yes, we have to. There are among the Jewish people like me and some of my friends who have been trained by Maganam, who are trained to carry. We're licensed and very extensively trained in how to use our firearms so that we can carry in shul. And I wish we didn't have to go through that training and have to provide that training, but we do. And our organization Maganam is having a fundraiser now. We all pay our own way. We buy our own equipment. We buy our own ammo. We pay our own expenses. But the organization subsidizes the training so that we can get more people online going through the training and licensed. It's a long process. It took me 1.5 years to go through that process. It's a lot of work. But anyone who takes on that responsibility of being a shomer, being a guard for his or her faith community, it's a heavy responsibility, but we honor you for doing it. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions that Nina is slipping to me. So that's what we've got on this nice Sunday night. Yasher Koach to you, starting the week off right. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific,